Shadow of the Moon, a Blackmoon Wars short story, written and copyright by J.T. Williams, 2025. This is a standalone short story featuring Dorien, Ranger of Taria, and his companion wolf Brutus. For more of this character, please check out Ranger's Oath Blackmoon. Wars Book 1 available on YouTube and in ebook and paperback on Amazon. Now let's get to the story. Shadow of the Moon. The wind swept across the barren slopes of the Crescent Mountains, carrying with it the bitter chill of approaching winter. Dorien pulled his ranger cloak tighter around his shoulders, his weathered face grimacing against the sting of ice particles that whipped past. The eastern reaches beyond Taria were desolate, a wasteland of jagged stone and stunted trees that clung desperately to cracks in the mountainside. "What do you think, Brutus?" Dorien murmured, glancing down at the gray wolf that padded silently beside him. The wolf's amber eyes gleamed with intelligence as it lifted its snout to the air, taking in the scents carried on the wind. Brutus had been with Dorien for 5 years now, ever since the ranger had found the injured pup trapped beneath a fallen tree during a patrol near the Great Wall. The bond between them had grown strong, forged in countless battles against the Icarn and their vampire masters. Brutus growled low in his throat, hackles rising slightly. "I smell it too," Dorien said, his hand moving to the hilt of his sword. "Blood. Old blood." The reports had come from a group of dwarven miners who had been prospecting in these mountains. Strange lights in an abandoned orc cave. Screams echoing across the valleys at night. And most disturbing of all, several miners had gone missing, their picks and supplies left behind as if they had simply vanished into the thin mountain air. Fadus had assigned Dorien to investigate, though both men knew what they feared: another front opening in the vampire war, another breach in their defenses while they still struggled to hold what untainted woods remained. "At least Zeno got the easier assignment," Dorien muttered to himself, remembering how his friend had been sent to escort supplies to the new settlement east of Avaria. The cave mouth yawned before them, a jagged slash in the mountainside, partially hidden behind a tumble of boulders. Ancient orc runes, crude but distinct, were carved into the stone around the entrance. Dorien ran his fingers over the symbols, recognizing warnings and territorial markings that had long since lost their power. The orcs had abandoned these mountains decades ago, driven out by the combined might of dwarves and humans during King Taria's early reign. "Strange place for a cult to take root," Dorien whispered, as he unslung his bow and nocked an arrow, ready to draw at a moment's notice. The ranger had been with Fadus long enough to know that vampire worshippers were among the most dangerous of foes. Unlike the mindless Icarn, thralled by their master's blood magic, cultists chose their allegiance freely, trading their humanity for the promise of power or immortality. Brutus prowled forward, taking point as they entered the darkness of the cave. Dorien followed, his ranger-trained eyes quickly adjusting to the gloom. The main tunnel sloped downward, ancient orc support beams creaking ominously above their heads. The air grew thick with the scent of damp stone and something else, something sickly sweet and metallic. They had traveled perhaps 50 paces into the mountain when Brutus froze, ears pricked forward. Dorien immediately pressed himself against the wall, bow half drawn. From somewhere ahead came the faint sound of chanting, the words unintelligible, but the cadence unmistakable. Ritual speech, the kind favored by those who sought to commune with dark powers. "Careful now," Dorien breathed to his companion as they crept forward. The tunnel widened suddenly into a large chamber, and Dorien dropped to a crouch behind a fallen stalagmite. What he saw made his blood run cold. The cavern had been transformed into a grotesque shrine. Dozens of candles cast a sickly red glow across the chamber, their wax mixed with what could only be blood. The walls were painted with crude symbols, Not orc runes, but the sinuous writing Dorien recognized from vampire lairs they had cleared near Lucan. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, its surface stained dark and wet. Around it knelt 7 figures dressed in black robes trimmed with red. Their heads were bowed as they chanted, and behind them stood an 8th figure, taller than the rest, arms raised toward the ceiling of the cave where a natural chimney opened to the night sky. Through this opening, the light of the black moon cast its baleful glow upon the scene. "Accept our offering, Lord Elria Sonia," the leader's voice rang out, and Dorien felt his throat tighten at the name. "Grant us the dark gift, that we may serve as your eyes and ears among the living." Dorian's gaze traveled to the far side of the chamber, where 3 figures hung suspended from chains, the missing miners, though only one still appeared to be breathing. The leader turned, and in the red candlelight, Dorien could see that the man's face was marked with self-inflicted cuts, arranged in the pattern of a bat's wings. "Bring forth the last," the leader commanded, and 2 cultists rose to retrieve the surviving miner. Dorien knew he had to act. Even if Elria Sonia himself wasn't present, any ritual dedicated to the vampire lord was dangerous beyond measure. He drew his bow to full extension, sighting on the cult leader. "Now, Brutus," he whispered. The wolf exploded from the shadows with a snarl that echoed through the chamber like thunder. Cultists scattered in panic as Brutus launched himself at the nearest robed figure, jaws closing around a throat. Dorian's arrow flew true, but at the last moment, the leader jerked aside with inhuman speed. The shaft grazed his shoulder instead of piercing his heart, and the man whirled toward Dorien with a hiss of pain and rage. "Ranger," the leader snarled, his eyes reflecting the candlelight like a cat's. "Kill him." The ritual must not be interrupted. Dorien dropped his bow and drew his sword in one fluid motion as 3 cultists rushed him with daggers raised. The first fell to a sweeping slash across the chest, the enchanted blade cutting through robes and flesh with equal ease. The second managed to nick Dorian's arm before a kick sent him sprawling. The third proved more skilled, weaving and darting with practiced movements. "You're too late, Ranger," the cultist taunted as they circled each other. "We've already tasted the blood of our lord. His gift flows in our veins." Across the chamber, Brutus had brought down another cultist and was grappling with a third who wielded a staff carved with obscene symbols. The wolf's fur was matted with blood, though whether his own or his enemies', Dorien couldn't tell. "Did your lord also gift you with his weakness to steel?" Dorien replied, fainting left before driving his blade into the cultist's side. The man screamed, but the sound transformed into a bubbling laugh as he clutched at Dorian's wrist, preventing him from withdrawing the sword. Despite the mortal wound, the cultist's strength was enormous. "We are his children now," the dying man gurgled, "and children grow stronger than their fathers." A flash of movement from the corner of his eye was Dorian's only warning. He released his sword and threw himself backward as the leader lunged at him, a curved black blade whistling through the air where his neck had been a moment before. Dorien rolled and came up with his hunting knife in hand, the silver inlaid hilt gleaming in the candlelight. The leader paused, eyeing the blade warily. "Silver, you come prepared, Ranger." "We've learned from our mistakes," Dorien said grimly. Since the fall of Sailmark, the Rangers had taken to carrying silver weapons as standard equipment. "Your master taught us that much." The leader's face contorted with rage. "You speak his name as if he were defeated. Lord Elria Sonia rises even now, gathering his strength while your pathetic alliance fractures and fails." "Yet here I am," Dorien said, "about to end your little cult before it begins." The leader's smile was terrible to behold. "Are you certain of that?" Too late, Dorien realized the chanting had resumed. The remaining cultists had regrouped around the altar where the last miner now lay, throat exposed to the Black Moon's light. The leader had merely been stalling for time. "Brutus!" Dorien shouted. "The altar!" The wolf, bleeding from a gash along his flank but still strong, bounded across the chamber toward the cultists. Dorien hurled his knife at the leader, forcing the man to dodge, then sprinted for his fallen sword. Everything happened at once. The ritual knife descended toward the miner's throat. Brutus leaped across the altar, jaws closing on the wrist of the cultist, wielding the blade. Dorien reclaimed his sword and spun to face the leader, who had recovered and was advancing with unnatural speed. "Your beast may have interrupted the sacrifice," the leader hissed, "but we have already been blessed by our Lord. Let me show you." The man's face began to change, skin pulling taut across suddenly prominent cheekbones, eyes sinking into dark hollows, while teeth lengthened to points. It wasn't a full transformation, not like the true vampires could achieve, but it was enough to make Dorian's heart hammer in his chest. "Half changed," Dorien muttered, "just like the cultists at Lucan." The leader lunged, moving faster than any human should be capable of. Dorien parried the first strike, but was driven back by the sheer force of the attack. The second cut laid open his leather armor across the chest, drawing a thin line of blood. "I smell your fear, Ranger," the leader said, circling. "It is intoxicating." Behind them, Brutus had dispatched the cultist with the ritual knife and was tearing into another. The surviving miners hung forgotten from their chains as the chamber descended into chaos. Dorien feinted, drawing the leader into overextending, then brought his sword up in a vicious arc that caught the cultist across the jaw. Black blood sprayed from the wound, hissing where it touched the stone floor. "Not blood," Dorien realized aloud. "Not yet, just tainted." The leader staggered but remained standing, fingers probing the wound with a look of fascination rather than pain. "You cannot kill what is becoming immortal." "Let's test that theory," Dorien replied, and charged. Their blades met with a shower of sparks, the enchanted steel of Dorien's sword singing against the black metal of the cultist's weapon. They exchanged a flurry of blows, Dorien's ranger training matching the unnatural speed and strength of his opponent. A howl of pain drew Dorien's attention for a split second. Brutus had been struck by a cultist's spear, the weapon pinning him momentarily to the ground. The distraction was all the leader needed. His blade slipped past Dorien's guard, slicing deep into his shoulder. Dorien grunted in pain, but used the close proximity to drive his knee into the cultist's stomach, creating space between them once more. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, blood soaking his sleeve. "First blood to me," the leader said, his distorted face twisting into a parody of a smile. "Soon you'll join us, Ranger. Your skills would be valued by our Lord." "I've seen what happens to those who serve vampire lords," Dorien spat. "I'll take my chances with death." The cultist's eyes narrowed. "Then death it shall be." Across the chamber, Brutus had freed himself from the spear and dispatched his attacker, but the wolf was limping badly, favoring his right hind leg. Dorien knew they were running out of time. His wound would slow him soon, and Brutus was injured. 4 cultists still stood, including the leader. He needed to end this quickly. "Brutus," Dorien called, his voice steady despite the pain. "Remember, Lucan." The wolf's ears pricked forward at the command, recognizing the battle plan they had used during the defense of the Pinewood town. Dorien reached into his belt pouch with his good hand and withdrew a small glass vial filled with clear liquid. "What trinket is this?" the leader sneered, advancing once more. Dorien smiled grimly. "A gift from the druids of Salemark, before your master burned their home to Brutus." He hurled the vial to the ground at the cultist's feet. It shattered, releasing a cloud of sparkling dust that hung in the air for a heartbeat before igniting with a brilliant flash. The leader screamed, hands flying to his eyes as the light, concentrated essence of fairy fountain, as bright as midday sun, seared his half-transformed flesh. Brutus struck from behind, hamstringing the blinded cultist with a savage bite. As the leader fell to his knees, Dorien stepped forward and brought his sword down in an executioner's arc, separating head from shoulders. The remaining cultists, seeing their leader fall, broke and ran for the tunnel. One made it, perhaps 10 paces, before Brutus brought him down. The others disappeared into the darkness, their footsteps echoing frantically. "Let them go," Dorien gasped, suddenly aware of how much blood he had lost. "They won't get far." He staggered to the altar and used his sword to cut down the miners. 2 were already dead, their bodies cold. The third, a young dwarf with a forked beard, still breathed, though his pulse was weak. "Brutus," Dorien called. "Here." The wolf limped to his side, muzzle stained black with cultist blood. Dorien tore strips from a fallen cultist's robe and bound both his own wound and the worst of Brutus's injuries. Then he hoisted the unconscious dwarf over his good shoulder. "Time to go," he said, looking around at the grotesque shrine. "We need to report this to Faddis." The journey back to the cave entrance was slow and painful. Twice they had to stop while Dorien fought against the darkness that threatened to cloud his vision. Brutus walked beside him, occasionally nudging him forward when he faltered. When they finally emerged into the pale light of dawn, Dorien nearly wept with relief. The black moon had set, and the normal sun was rising over the eastern mountains, banishing the shadows that had seemed so impenetrable within the cave. He laid the dwarf carefully on the ground and fumbled in his pack for the signal horn all rangers carried. The blast echoed across the valleys, sure to be heard by the dwarven outpost 2 leagues distant. "Help will come," he told Brutus, sinking down beside the wolf and leaning against a boulder. "We did it, old friend." Brutus settled beside him, head on paws, amber eyes watchful despite his exhaustion. Dorien's thoughts turned to what they had witnessed. A cult dedicated to Elria Sonia, here in the eastern mountains, far from the front lines of the vampire war. Half-transformed cultists with unnatural strength. It spoke of a greater threat than they had realized, that Elria Sonia's influence was spreading even to remote regions of Taria. "We'll need to sweep the whole mountain range," he murmured to Brutus. "Set up patrols. Maybe have the Archons examine the area for magical traces." The wolf huffed in what might have been agreement. Dorien's eyes grew heavy as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. He fought to stay awake, knowing that the mountains were still dangerous, but his body had reached its limit. The last thing he saw before consciousness faded was a phoenix silhouetted against the morning sky, wings spread wide as it circled above them. Reinforcements from Castle Taria, perhaps even Kurla herself coming to their aid. "Always had good timing," Dorien whispered as darkness claimed him. But even as he slipped into unconsciousness, one truth remained certain. The Blackmoon Wars were far from over. New threats arose even as old ones were defeated, and as long as rangers like Dorien drew breath, they would stand against the darkness, whatever form it took. The wolf kept watch, loyal guardian to his fallen companion, as the phoenix descended toward them like a falling star.